So, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this 168th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. We're a smaller crowd this week than we might normally be. It's the middle of the summer, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, and so that may mean that more people are away than they might be. And by all accounts, there's a massive IT Microsoft outage all around the world today. Somehow Teams is still functioning, so hopefully we'll be able to enjoy today. It's a pleasure to have Brian Marein from Wake Forest University, who's going to present. For those of us that are here, of course, Brian, are you happy to take questions as we go along, or would you prefer to park everything for the Q&A at the end?
Yeah, sure. If you have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer them as they come.
Okay, great. Well, what people normally do is they raise their hand, and if you can't see it, I'll usually interrupt you and they'll ask their question. But one way or another, we'll manage to ask the questions. And that's about all, really. So, Brian, I'll encourage you to see if you can share your screen and take away your talk.
Okay, let's see. Sorry. Okay, so I actually am pretty unfamiliar with Teams specifically. So I click share and then it says screen and then window.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. I think I got it now. Yeah.
Yeah. A window would be a specific one. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Got it.
Great. Okay. Great. So this is Narrow Paths Out of Poverty and Educational Demand, Evidence from Dominican Baseball. I'm Brian Marein from Wake Forest, and my co-author is Craig Paulson at Utah State. So around a decade or so ago, this documentary came out that showcased the production of baseball talent in the Dominican Republic. And you can see on this advertisement, they describe baseball as being the Dominican Republic's most valuable export. Now, it's not actually true that baseball players are the country's most valuable export, but I think that speaks to the importance of baseball in that country. The DR has a population of around 11 million people, yet they supply more than 1 in 10 players in American Major League Baseball. And if we think about minor league baseball, which is really just a broader definition of professional baseball in North America, Dominicans make up about 1/4 of players. So really, it's impossible to think about baseball without thinking about the Dominican Republic. And likewise, you can't think about the Dominican Republic without thinking about baseball. At the beginning of this documentary, this young man who's being interviewed, he says, "People say teams will give me all the money in the world." So to put you in the right context, we are dealing with a developing country, particularly if we think back to when Major League Baseball first starts recruiting there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. At that point, we should really be thinking about a low-income country. And the national heroes in the Dominican Republic that young boys see on TV or hear about on the radio or elsewhere, they are making many millions of dollars in the United States. So to give you one example, Albert Pujols, around a decade ago, signed a contract for about $250 million. Again, that's $250 million US dollars. So it's not hard to imagine that these young boys growing up in some form of poverty would be enticed by the possibility of playing baseball in the United States. This young man who's being interviewed, he says, "I need to sign so I can help my mom get out of here." So the wording here is important. He's not saying that it would be great if I signed a Major League Baseball contract. He's saying that I need to sign it because that's how I'm going to get my mom out of poverty, right? He's not discussing education, right? He's saying like this is my path out, and so really this is the issue that we're going to get at. In recent years, Major League Baseball has run into a significant PR crisis because many journalists have described this, like Vice Sports is in their documentary, as an education crisis, the education crisis crippling Dominican baseball players. The issue is that these young boys see their national heroes playing baseball, making millions of dollars in the United States. They overestimate their chances of success. They think that that can be them as well. And so the concern is that they are sacrificing years of adolescence uh, stepping away from school in order to pursue this career that will almost certainly not work out for them, right? To be competitive, to be able to sign a Major League Baseball contract when you're 16 years old, you have to be training, seriously training for years in advance. And so the concern is that these young boys are dropping out of school in these critical years. Uh, this young man in the documentary, he did sign a contract with a major league team, but while he was in the minor leagues, he injured his elbow. He wasn't able to recover from it, and he says here I am in the barbershop making 375 a head, and what he's saying is that he spent all of these years, all of these teenage years, practicing baseball, really developing skills that don't translate to any other industries. And because baseball just didn't work out for him, he's not left with many lucrative employment opportunities. So what we're doing in this paper is we're asking, does Major League Baseball recruitment worsen the educational outcomes of teenage boys in the Dominican Republic? As I'll discuss momentarily, there's been a lot of attention in the popular press about this issue, but there's there's really a lack of consideration among those who have covered this issue about what these boys would be doing if they weren't playing baseball. We know that thousands of boys are playing baseball, but the question is, would they have been in school or would they be doing something else? And so that's really what we're trying to understand in this paper. And in a broader sense, we're using baseball in the Dominican Republic as an opportunity to study really a larger issue, which is, do paths out of poverty with low probabilities of success reduce the demand for schooling? Uh, what we mean by this is there are many careers, particularly in sports and entertainment, that are defined by really low probabilities of success. You're almost guaranteed to not succeed in these careers. But if you do, the rewards are quite high, right? In particular, fame and fortune. So do these types of opportunities, do they influence the demand for schooling? To answer the question, we're going to exploit the sudden entry of Major League Baseball into the Dominican Republic in the 1970s and variation in pre-existing baseball cultures within the Dominican Republic in a difference in difference framework. Essentially, all we're asking is, do we see a relative decline in the educational outcomes of boys in areas where Major League Baseball tends to recruit in the period after Major League Baseball starts recruiting there? In answering that question, we're speaking to really a large established literature that has shown that educational demand is quite responsive to the returns to schooling. So, for example, if a factory moves into town, offers employment opportunities for unskilled labor, this increases the opportunity cost of attending class. And so predictably, some students are going to drop out to pursue those jobs. So we know that that's the case. What's different about our study is that it's just a very different type of job. This isn't a job where, you show up to the factory, you either get the job or you don't. With baseball or other careers in sports and entertainment, really you have to train for many years in advance operating under uncertainty, right? If you're a young boy who wants to play professional baseball, you're going to be spending years training to be able to sign by the time you reach adulthood. And during that entire period, it's unclear whether you'll succeed in that sport. And so it's sort of defined by high risk and high reward. And so really we're extending that literature by looking at a different type of profession. Really, it's not so much that baseball would affect the returns to schooling, but rather the perceived returns to schooling, right? If boys are overestimating their chances of success in baseball, this might influence how they think about the returns of schooling, even if their perception is a bit off. The paper is also speaking to a literature on the effects of athletics on education, but previous studies have tended to look at developed economies, places where compulsory schooling tends to be enforced, places like Germany and the United States. And those papers, when they think about the effect of athletics on education, they tend to focus on, for example, like the soft skills that you would develop playing on a team. In our context, we're focusing on a developing country where a large proportion of the population does not attend school, despite compulsory schooling laws. And so, again, we're thinking about how athletics might affect education when there is the opportunity to leave school. The paper is also speaking to an ongoing policy debate. So Major League Baseball, the Major League Baseball Players Association, and government agencies are actively involved and have been for years in a policy discussion about how to address this issue of young boys pursuing baseball potentially to the detriment of their education. And finally, the paper is clarifying results from two previous studies. So the first of these, Watch 2009, is sort of a simplistic analysis in a legal journal that simply shows that if you compare within the Dominican Republic boys to girls, that boys start dropping out of school at a higher rate than girls, starting around ages 12 and 13, the ages where we might expect boys to start pursuing baseball seriously. But that's presented sort of as what they describe as circumstantial evidence. Chan 2020 is the only really sophisticated applied microtype paper. This comes from a University of Washington PhD student. It's one of her dissertation chapters. And she, as I'll talk about later in the presentation, looks at the expansion of visas to the United States in 2006 and tries to understand if this expansion of opportunities to come to the United States to play baseball changes educational choices. She finds no effect, although as we'll argue, the change in visa policy doesn't clearly affect the perceived returns to education. And so we think that the null result that she finds is somewhat uninformative. With that being said, we also find no significant effect of Major League Baseball on educational attainment. It's not that there are no cases where students are dropping out to pursue baseball, but it doesn't seem to be sort of this systematic effect. It's certainly not the way that it's described in the popular press. In a USAID study from 2022, in surveys, these young boys who are playing baseball, they describe their career path through education as being complex and uncertain. And so we think that perhaps what is explaining the null result is that Dominicans systematically underestimate the returns to education, which is consistent with Jensen's 2010 study of the Dominican Republic. So again, it's not necessarily that baseball is moving people out of education. It may just be that a relatively low proportion of people are completing middle school or high school because people throughout the country underestimate the returns to education. And again, if at any point you have a question, feel free to jump in. But now I'll start jumping into the paper. Before I talk about the empirics, let me just give you a little bit of background about baseball in the Dominican Republic, because in our difference in difference, we are going to not only be exploiting the entry of Major League Baseball into that country, but also spatial variation in exposure to the shock. So it's important to understand where that spatial variation comes from. It really comes down to the historical uneven diffusion of baseball. Baseball first came to the DR in the 19th century from Cubans, but it was really popularized in the early 20th century by wealthy students in the capital, Santo Domingo. These students, many of them had traveled and studied in the United States, developed a taste for American baseball culture, and then brought that back to the Dominican Republic. But where it diffused to the working class and throughout the rest of the country is through the sugar industry. The Dominican Republic was a major player in what's been called the American Sugar Kingdom in the Caribbean in the early 20th century. There's a significant presence of American sugar plantations, American sugar companies in the country. And the way that sugar is planted is that there's around a 6-month dead period, a period where workers are idle, they don't have much work to do. And so in order to maintain a local labor force and entertain workers, these American sugar companies would sponsor baseball teams and organize games between the various sugar mills. So what we start to see in the early 20th century is these fierce baseball rivalries developing between the different sugar producing communities. Um, and so we start to see these baseball cultures forming in the areas where sugar was produced. And we can see that that's not uniformly across the country. Sugar tended to be produced on the southern coast, in particular in the East Coast around San Pedro. If we jump ahead and look at where professional baseball players tend to come from today, so this is the per capita number of professional baseball players who debuted between 1977 and 2010, broken out by province. And the provinces are separated into terciles, with black representing the highest per capita rates and white representing the lowest. We can see that baseball players tend to come from most of the same areas that historically or even today produce sugar. It's not that sugar is going to directly enter into our empirical strategy, but rather I'm just providing this background to help you understand where we get the spatial variation in baseball culture. If we look across the world, not by province, but by cities, the per capita number of Major League Baseball players produced in cities across the world, the Dominican Republic has 4 out of the top 5. And San Pedro is far and away the most important producer of baseball talent on a per capita basis of anywhere in the world. And it also happens to be the historical epicenter of the Dominican sugar industry. So baseball is popular in the DR in the early 20th century, but it takes many decades before we see a significant presence of Dominicans in Major League Baseball. So how do we get there? Part of the reason that we don't see Dominicans playing Major League Baseball in the early 20th century is because there was a color barrier. Black players, people of color, could not play in American professional baseball until the late 1940s and into the 50s. Most Dominicans have some African descent, would generally not be considered white by American standards, and so were effectively barred from American professional baseball. But even so, we still don't see Dominicans playing in significant numbers until a little bit thereafter. It all comes down to how baseball players were recruited. So historically, major league teams would send scouts around the country. They would try to identify the top high school players in the United States. They would develop relationships with those players. They would invest in their training. And then once those players turned 18, they would sign them to a professional contract. There were 2 problems with this system. The first is that teams had to compete over signing players. And so they competed by offering them signing bonuses, and that was cutting into their bottom lines. They didn't like that. The second problem is that it led to competitive imbalance. So the largest market teams, so for example, the New York Yankees, could afford to send scouts and sign the very best players in the country, and so they attracted the best talent. And that sounds nice, except that games need to be interesting to fill the seats. What they found is that in one season in the early 1960s, the New York Yankees had effectively run away with the American League Championship, their league's championship, halfway through the season. And if there are 162 games of baseball in a season, that means that there are an awful lot of games that aren't very meaningful. It was hard for them to fill their stadium, and so they recognized that the league needs to become more competitive in order to increase fan interest. So in 1965, they implemented a draft for domestic players. What this now meant is that if you're an American player and you want to enter Major League Baseball, you enter your name in the draft, and then teams in an order take turns picking players from the draft. And this effectively eliminated any benefit, any expected benefit of investing in training U.S. talent, right? If you're the New York Yankees and you go and you develop this relationship and you train a player, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to sign that player. It's essentially just luck if that player is still available by the time your time comes up in the draft. We know that this. Oh, sorry. I should mention The draft only applied to domestic players, really because the overwhelming majority of players were U.S. born. So foreign players were an afterthought. They also just thought it would be difficult to try to apply these new rules to foreign players. For example, if the foreign players had signed a contract already in their home country. Um, what this did, as I said, is it removed this benefit of investing in U.S. talent, and we know that this had a significant effect. So let me just jump ahead for a moment. If you follow Major League Baseball, every year there will be a discussion at the beginning of the season. Why do we not see U.S.-born Black players in Major League Baseball? Historically, African American players played a very important role in Major League Baseball, but not really today. There are a lot of players of color, but they're mostly from Latin America. Why don't we see them? Well, Bailey and Shepard explain it in this way. Major League Baseball was no longer investing in the development of U.S. talent, and so U.S. players were more reliant on community investments in baseball training. African Americans were coming from disproportionately poor communities that had fewer resources to develop talent. And so although in general we see a decline in the importance of American players, it particularly hits African American players hard. We see it even more clearly with Puerto Ricans. So Puerto Rico is an American territory. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but until 1989 or 1990, Puerto Ricans were treated as foreign players. So there are these several decades where Puerto Ricans don't have to go through the draft. So we see a significant amount of Major League Baseball investment in Puerto Rico, but as soon as they're counted as domestic players, that investment dries up. And now, once again, you'll see discussion of why don't we see Puerto Rican players? Well, the reason is because of the draft rules. So we know the draft is important. And just a final point on that, every year there's discussion about whether there should be an international draft. And the Major League Baseball Players Association, essentially the players union, blocks this because the Dominican players understand that if you implement an international draft, then investment in the DR will dry up, and so the Dominican players drop out. So we know the draft is really important. So after 1965, Major League teams start to look elsewhere to gain a competitive advantage, but this happens slowly because they're not used to recruiting outside the U.S. Naturally, they go to places where there's already significant baseball culture, and in the 20th century, the U.S. has this huge influence in the Caribbean. Many places in the Caribbean are occupied by the U.S. military. They develop, they sort of import baseball culture, and so the Caribbean basin is really a hotbed for baseball talent. And so teams increasingly start scouting the Caribbean. They probably would have focused on Cuba, which was the most important foreign producer of baseball talent before the Cuban Revolution. But after the U.S. embargo, teams can't recruit there, and so they go to the Dominican Republic instead. There's a turning point in 1977. The Toronto Blue Jays, they're a new team in Major League Baseball. They opened the first permanent training facility there. Today, these are the Dominican academies are state-of-the-art facilities where teams house, feed, provide health care, and train players in anticipation of then shipping them to the U.S. to play baseball. So the Toronto Blue Jays opened the first academy in 1977, and over the next several decades, every major league team, as well as one Japanese team, also opened a training facility, and those still operate today. So based on what I've described so far, there's not a sharp treatment timing. With that being said, if we look at the number of Dominicans playing in Major League Baseball or debuting in Major League Baseball by year, that dashed vertical line is the opening of the first Major League Baseball academy, and we can see that thereafter there's a sharp upswing throughout the 80s, 90s, and beyond of Dominicans playing professional baseball. So if baseball is having this detrimental effect on education, as is alleged, we would expect that that effect would emerge sometime around 1980, and then it would increase in magnitude over the next several decades. The way that baseball and baseball recruiting works in the DR is, like any other sport around the world, kids start playing it or in their community, with their parents, uh, with other kids in the community, informally. Um, and then in the Dominican Republic, boys start to get scouted and trained by what are called buscones around the age of 11, 12, or really 13 years old. These buscones, they're not affiliated with Major League Baseball. They're private trainers, and they try to identify the best talent. Then they take players under their wing. In many cases, they house them, they feed them, and they train them to try to get them signed to a major league contract when they're 16. The way that it works is that these scouts get paid a fraction of the signing bonus uh, when ultimately some of their players get signed. Uh, once players are 16, they can sign with a major league team, and then they go to the training academies, and then thereafter they can go to the United States to play baseball. Because this system, most of it operates before players get to the academies at age 16, and since most of the players never make it to an academy, it's hard to gauge how many boys are actually training for Major League Baseball. We know that tons of players are playing baseball, but how many are actually seriously pursuing a career in Major League Baseball? Estimates vary between 21,000 and more than 100,000 at any given time in recent years. And this translates to about 3 to 15% of all teenage boys around the country. Of course, in communities where baseball players tend to come from, we would expect that this proportion would be significantly higher. The problem here is that the overwhelming majority of players are never going to succeed in professional baseball. Right? So one estimate is that 97% of prospects never sign any form of professional contract. That's not a Major League Baseball contract. That's getting paid in any form for playing baseball. Of the 3% who do sign a professional contract, only about 2% of that 3% make it to Major League Baseball. So we're talking about a small fraction of 1% of these boys who are training for Major League Baseball will ever actually make it to the major leagues. This system, essentially where these boys are being set up for failure, has, as I mentioned, attracted a lot of attention. There are a number of articles that have come out in legal journals in recent years that have called for reform, calling on the Dominican government, the American government, or Major League Baseball to regulate or even put an end to this system of recruitment, describing it as the exploitation of child labor. Many articles in the popular press have come out, not only in major sports outlets like ESPN or Fox Sports, but also in general interest outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today. I mean, every year you're going to see articles about this. Think tanks have been writing about this, discussing how to regulate the industry. And as I mentioned, governments are involved as well. The U.S. Agency for International Development published a report 2 years ago, really a survey of these baseball players to try to understand the magnitude of the issue. And the Dominican Ministry of Education in 2017, they published a report called The Proposal to Resolve School Desertion Among Baseball Prospects. So again, this is a major issue in this country, and one that is being addressed by the government itself. To give you a sense of how baseball is being described here, being described there, here's an excerpt from The Nation, a popular outlet in the United States, that says there are thousands of Dominican players cast aside by a major league system that is strip mining the Dominican Republic for talent. Unmentioned is the overarching relationship Major League Baseball has with the Dominican Republic, harvesting talent on the cheap with no responsibility for who gets left behind. Right, so they're not holding any punches here. Major League Baseball has received a ton of bad press. Their response has generally been not to argue or fight the issue. They say, okay, we acknowledge that this is an issue. It says here we're aware of the fact that these boys, once they go to the academy, they don't go back to school, and then their response has been essentially to just invest many millions of dollars in the Dominican education system. Even so, even with this admission, if it's really the case that what we're focused on is the academies. The baseball academies represent such a small fraction of the boys playing baseball that even here, it's unclear the magnitude of the problem. Right. But as I said, Major League Baseball has invested significantly in this. They have, not only in education itself, but also in a PR campaign. They collaborate with the Players Association and with USAID to invest in Dominican education. Okay, so let me now take you to the paper itself, or our study, to understand the extent to which baseball is having this effect on education. We're going to use just census data, right? Public use, IPUM's census data for 1981, 2002, and 2010. Although, as I'll describe in a moment, we mostly focus on the 2010 census. This gives us information like birth year, sex, and province of birth. And it also gives us educational outcomes, whether that be attendance in that census year or years of schooling retrospectively. We also know where baseball players come from. So online statistical aggregators have information on the birthplaces of every Major League Baseball player dating back to the beginning of Major League Baseball in the 19th century. Although for Dominicans, it's not really important. We're going to be focused more on the late 20th century. We also have minor league baseball data for all of the minor leagues starting in 1977. And again, we scraped these online statistical aggregators to understand where baseball players tend to come from. To assess the effect of baseball on educational outcomes, we start with really our main analysis here is a difference in difference using the 2010 census only. So the time dimension when we're using the 2010 census is going to be birth year. The basic logic here is that earlier birth cohorts would have been too old to have been exposed to Major League Baseball recruiting. Major League doesn't have a major presence in the DR until the late 1970s or really into the 1980s. And so again, those earlier cohorts should not have been affected by Major League Baseball recruiting. Later cohorts, they would have been growing up around middle school age at the time where there's a significant Major League Baseball presence, and so they are going to be more affected. So what we're doing is we're regressing an educational outcome that could either be just completion, right? A binary variable for middle school completion, high school completion, or it could be years of schooling. For those born in Province P in year T, we include province and birth year fixed effects. It says birth year, but really we are combining 4 birth years together in order to maintain sufficiently large sample sizes. And then the variable of interest is going to be this exposure variable, this pre-MLB variable, which we define as the number of professional baseball players, minor or major league baseball players, active in 1977, born in Province P divided by the population of that province. So essentially a per capita measure of professional baseball players from that province. We use 1977 because that's the first year that we have minor league data. And the minor leagues, there's just so many more minor league players. So we think that that's a less noisy measure than just using Major League Baseball. And it's important that we have 1977 as well, because that's the year that the first Major League Baseball Academy opens in the DR. And we want a measure that we think is unaffected by Major League investments in the DR. Here, we're only looking at men, right? Because women girls are not recruited for professional baseball. And we're only going to include men born between 1951 and 1990. Before 1951, we start running into small sample issues. And after 1990, we think that the people may be too young to have completed their education. Now, I said it's important for us to have an exposure variable. Sorry, I should have mentioned the exposure variable does not vary over time, and so we interact it with the birth year fixed effects. It's important for the exposure variable to have been determined prior to Major League Baseball entering the DR, right? We don't want our exposure variable to be influenced by Major League Baseball investments. But as we see, the number of players from a province in 1977 is very strongly correlated with, it strongly predicts the number of players who will debut over the next several decades from that province, really with one exception. So sort of another way that you could think about it is what we're asking is, well, do we see a relative decline in educational outcomes for boys in the areas where baseball players tend to come from? And the answer that we find is no. So we don't find evidence of significant pre-trends. And then after our reference period, we don't see any evidence of a decline. What we're looking at here is 8th grade completion. So it's called primary school in the Dominican Republic, but you can think of it as like middle school. We would think that if boys are dropping out of school, that this is really the relevant outcome to look at, given that they might start dropping out around ages 12 or 13. And additionally, the high school completion rate is so low, at least at the beginning of our sample, only like 1 in 4 Dominican boys would have finished high school in the 1970s. So we think that looking at 8th grade is maybe a better outcome to look at. But again, we find no evidence of an effect. We don't see clearly there's no jump, but sort of in line with the number of Dominicans debuting in professional baseball, we might expect sort of a downward sloping effect, and we don't find any evidence of that. In fact, many of the post-treatment coefficients are positive. If we average them over the entire post-treatment period, the average effect is a 0.6 percentage point increase in the probability of completing 8th grade, with a 1 standard deviation increase in the exposure variable. Based on the 95% confidence interval, we can rule out a decline in the probability of completing 8th grade of 0.6 percentage points, with a 1 standard deviation increase in the exposure variable. So these are statistically and economically insignificant effects. Now, one concern that we might have is that what we're finding is not a true null effect, but rather an underpowered null. And so to address that issue, we run a power simulation. So what we do is we randomly reassign the treatment variable across provinces. And then we mechanically reduce the 8th grade completion rate in those communities based on the placebo treatment. And then we rerun the analysis, test for an effect, and then calculate power. So what we see is that we have, with 50% power, we can detect an effect of around 1 percentage point reduction in 8th grade completion, with a standard deviation increase in the exposure variable. With 80% power, we can detect an effect of about 2 percentage points. To put this in terms that are a little bit easier to understand, if we go from the least affected communities, the communities where in 1977 there was not a single professional baseball player from that community, all the way to San Pedro, which, as I said, is far and away the most important producer in per capita terms of baseball talent of anywhere in the world, we would expect an effect of around 13 percentage points. That's based on really the most conservative estimates, right? So if we take the low end estimates of who's playing baseball, 3% of boys in the country, and we reassign that to communities, that 3% to communities based on where players tend to come from, we would expect an effect of about 13 percentage points. We have 50% power to detect an effect there of about 7 percentage points, and with 80% power, about 11 percentage points. So we have enough power to be able to rule out certainly the largest effects that we would expect under the most conservative assumptions. If we if we relax that, remember that the estimates of who's playing baseball ranges from 3 to all the way up to 15% of all teenage boys. Of course, we would be even more sufficiently powered. So again, we think that we have enough power to rule out the most extreme effects and a reasonable amount of power to rule out even much smaller effects. We can also look at other outcomes. So if we look at 12th grade completion, we find a very similar pattern, really no evidence whatsoever of an effect. These are both statistically and economically insignificant effects. If we look at years of schooling, we see something very similar. Really, it's a flat line from throughout the treatment period. So again, no evidence that baseball is having the effect that is alleged. One concern might be that, as we sort of saw before, San Pedro is an outlier. Its exposure variable, the value for its exposure variable is much higher than other provinces, and so we might be concerned that San Pedro is driving the results entirely. If we throw out San Pedro, once again, we find no effect for 8th grade completion. We might also be concerned that our exposure variable is noisy because we're only using the 1 year of Major League Baseball and minor league baseball data. And so even though it's conceptually a little difficult to think about an exposure variable that includes anyone who debuted from 1977 to 2010, as a robustness check, we run the analysis with an exposure variable that includes the per capita number of players that debuted over those 3 decades. And we once again find a very similar pattern, both statistically and economically insignificant effects. Another concern that we might have would be that relying on the 2010 census, which is a retrospective analysis, is a little bit messy, right? Dealing with reported years of education many decades after the fact. So another way that we can get at this is by looking at attendance in the census year, right? So we can look at the 1981, the 2002, and the 2010 census. We would essentially rerun the same analysis, except here we're going to look at boys ages 13 to 16. These are really the core years where we would expect boys to be dropping out of school if baseball is having this effect. Otherwise, it's the same analysis. We include province fixed effects, and then we have age by census year fixed effects. So again, the time dimension here is census year rather than birth year. And then we allow age cohorts to have different trends at the national level within this analysis. And here, once again, if we focus on the first column, we find no evidence of an effect, right? So from the 1981 to the 2002 census, what this is saying is that there's a 0.2 percentage point increase in the probability of completing 8th grade, or excuse me, not completing 8th grade, in the probability of attending school, reporting that you're attending school in that census year, with a 1 standard deviation increase in the exposure variable. For 2010, it would be a 0.2 percentage point decrease. And in neither case are these statistically significant. Perhaps you might be concerned, or you might think that, well, comparing provinces over these extended periods of time is problematic. So rather than comparing across censuses, what we can do is we can leverage the fact that girls are not recruited for professional baseball, and so what we're doing here is a triple difference, where we're asking, do boys see a relative decline in their educational outcomes compared to girls? in communities that are more exposed to baseball recruiting after Major League Baseball starts to recruit there. And so here again, this is a within province comparison. We're allowing girls and boys to have different educational trajectories at the national level, but we're comparing them then within province. Otherwise, it's the same analysis as before. And here again, we find no evidence of an effect. Actually, in this case, we see that some of the coefficients, both before and after the reference period, are statistically significant, but that's really just because our reference cohort is something of an anomaly in terms of trends in eighth grade completion. However, if we just focus on the coefficients aside from the reference cohort, it's essentially a straight line over this entire period, right? There's nothing in this that is suggestive of a significant downward trend or a downward jump in eighth grade completion comparing boys to girls. That's true for 12th grade or high school completion as well, and it's true for years of schooling. We're seeing very, very similar results. And qualitatively similar results between the double and the triple differences. So I mentioned before that really the only other sort of applied micro study of this issue is a dissertation chapter from a University of Washington student, PhD student, from 2020, and in her analysis, she looks at the effect of the Compete Act of 2006. So this is a change in U.S. visas, an expansion of U.S. visas that's passed in 2006. And what this did is it increased the supply of H-2B visas that minor league baseball players could use to come stateside. Not only minor league players, but other workers as well. And so the idea here is that after this law is passed, this increases the chances that young boys will be able to play baseball in the United States, and so this is going to increase their beliefs in their likelihood of succeeding in baseball, and this is going to reduce the returns to education. So John 2020 looks at the 2002 and the 2010 censuses and makes a comparison over those periods. Specifically, though, she compares treated areas, which she defines as areas that are close to the Major League Baseball academies, so different than how we're defining it. And then the control group is going to be the communities that are outside of a given radius of the Major League Baseball academies. The idea here is that boys that are closer to the Major League Baseball academies are going to be more exposed to scouts and therefore more likely to end up in Major League Baseball. Those who are further away are going to have difficulty finding themselves in front of professional baseball scouts. She also, as for the triple difference, is going to compare two age cohorts. So she compares 14 to ages 14 to 17 to ages 18 to 21. The idea is that well, in the 2002 census, none of those groups are going to be affected by the visa expansion, but in 2010, the boys who are ages 14 to 17 would have been the right age to start ratcheting up their baseball training to pursue a career in the United States, whereas the boys who are 18 to 21 would have been a little bit too old to have started pursuing baseball professionally when the expansion of visas kicked in. We argue that this analysis is problematic because, first of all, the way that she defines these control municipalities, many of the municipalities in her control group are areas that, on a per capita basis, produce a very high number of baseball players, and so we think that the control group is contaminated. And the second issue is that it's not obvious that this changed the perceived returns to education. So this is a graph from her paper And this is just a simple time series of the number of Dominicans playing in the U.S. minor leagues. And you can see in 2007, when the expansion of visas actually kicks in, she argues that there's a clear uptick in the number of minor league baseball players. From our perspective, it's essentially the continuation of a trend with some annual variation. And so it's not obvious to us that this would have made any had any real impact on the returns to education. With that being said, Klein 2014 is really the best book on baseball in the Dominican Republic, and it acknowledges, it says that H2B visas were somewhat limited before 2006, so that teams actually did had to be selective in determining who would be sent to the minor leagues once the law expanded the number of visas. Really, this unclogged that bottleneck, and so really to cover all bases here, we're going to re-examine this 2006 visa expansion, but we're going to tweak it by using an exposure variables more similar to what we used previously, rather than this what we think is the problematic control and treated units. So what we do is we are going to use as our exposure variable any the number per capita number of Dominicans from a given province who debuted at any time prior to 2006. And here we find, both for years of schooling and for primary completion, we once again find no significant effect, right? So in fact, the coefficients are slightly positive, but they're insignificant. Any way that we look at it, right? So we looked comparing boys across communities over time. We looked at comparing boys to girls within communities over time, based on the MLB's entry in the Dominican Republic. And we also look at this 2006 US visa expansion in a similar way and find no evidence. So any way that we look at it, many different specifications, we find no evidence whatsoever that baseball is having this effect. So how do we make sense of this? Unfortunately, we can't clearly pin down what is driving this null result. But I think that the 2022 USAID study, this survey of baseball players prior to actually going to the Major League Baseball academies, can shed some light on this. So in that survey of these 500 or so prospects who were interviewed, 96% were still attending school, even though they were pursuing baseball professionally. Although only 27% of them were enrolled in traditional school. So that means that, most of the boys are either taking evening classes or they're taking weekend classes. So one explanation could just be that boys are much more attached to the schooling system despite pursuing baseball than previously thought. This is a possibility. We think that since our analysis is more focused on the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that this is this is unlikely. Probably these evening and weekend classes that boys are taking are a reflection of the bad press that Major League Baseball has gotten, and it's a reflection of attempts in recent years to try to get these boys to graduate. But it's a possibility. Likely in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this emphasis on education probably did not exist. Another explanation comes from the result that only about a quarter of the boys were playing baseball more than 20 hours a week. So although they are training seriously for a career in professional baseball because they're in one of these informal training programs, 3/4 of them are playing less than 20 hours a week or up to 20 hours a week, which is a lot of baseball, but also leaves a lot of time for other activities. If you look at time use surveys for American high school athletes who are in season, the numbers are not going to be all that different, right? The typical American high schooler who's in season is playing something like, I think it's 13 hours a week. So again, it leaves opportunity to continue schooling. So again, it may be that the boys are more attached to schooling than previously thought, that baseball is not getting in the way. Um, this idea that boys are they're significantly overestimating their chance of success in baseball. Those are true, and we see that in the surveys. But it doesn't appear to be the case that these are like risk-loving teenagers. If anything, they appear risk-averse when they're asked questions about lotteries. Of course, these are just surveys, so take them with a grain of salt. But really what comes out of the USAID study is that when asked about education, the boys describe a career path through, a more traditional route through education really as being complex and uncertain. It's not that they're knowingly giving up this lucrative career that they would have gotten if they had just continued through education, in pursuit of baseball. It may just be the case that they wouldn't be seriously invested in their education anyway, because there's not an appreciation across the country for the high returns to education, which is again consistent with Jensen's 2010 study of the Dominican Republic, which shows that Dominicans systematically underestimate the returns to education, and that explains the underinvestment in education in his paper. So again, it may not be so much that they're overestimating their success in baseball, although they do. It could be explained by the fact that they're significantly undervaluing education. What we think is the most likely explanation is sort of in line with this, which is that many of these boys likely would not have been in school anyway, right? So there's this tendency for American journalists to go to a developing country and see society through the lens of American standards, right? So when they see 14, 15-year-old boys playing baseball, they might think, well, what would a 14 or 15-year-old boy in New York City be doing? And the answer would be that, well, they'd be in school in the middle of the day on a Wednesday. But that's not necessarily going to be the case in the Dominican Republic. In the 70s and 80s, only around a quarter of boys are completing high school, and only slightly more than 50% are completing middle school. And so it's a rather large assumption to believe that these boys would have been in school, at least a large number of them would be in school if they weren't playing baseball. And so we think that that's probably the most likely explanation, although again, we don't have the data to be able to pin that down. So to sort of wrap things up, I think I'm just about at an hour now. We find that in the Dominican context, this is an area where the recruitment for professional sports is uniquely concentrated. It's not, baseball is an international sport, it is, but the recruitment of professional players is uniquely focused in this one small area, right? So this gives us a really nice laboratory for trying to understand whether baseball or more broadly these types of careers have this detrimental effect on education. And we don't find any evidence that that's the case. Again, it doesn't mean that no one is dropping out of school to or otherwise sacrificing their education in pursuit of professional baseball or professional sporting career. We know that this is going to be the case, but it doesn't seem to be this broad effect as it's often painted, both in legal journals and in the popular press. So beyond baseball, we think that these sort of narrow paths out of poverty are unlikely to systematically shape educational outcomes. And finally, again, we think that this can help to inform the ongoing policy debate with Major League Baseball. It's not to suggest that Major League Baseball shouldn't be investing in education. We think that those sorts of investments are a great benefit that comes with so much Major League Baseball attention in the Dominican Republic. But if we're going to have a meaningful policy debate, we should try to understand the costs and benefits. And here we don't think that there's a major cost in terms of students dropping out of school. So with that, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. That's a really interesting talk. I'm going to give you a team's round of applause. And we've now got, because of your perfect timing, we've now got exactly half an hour for questions and comments. So if anyone would like to raise a hand, ask a question, pose a comment, please go ahead. Now, Georgi, first of all.
Oh, great. Brian, thank you very much for sharing all the insights. It's indeed a very interesting research. So my question is more on since you find sort of by and large these, sort of like you mentioning there's no significant impact of baseball career pursuit on education in this particular setting. But do you think those stories, like there should be like any policy debate on um, sort of like at least educating these young players on what their true chances of success are? Or do you think it's simply, so much ingrained in the culture by now that they will be trying no matter what, and we shouldn't really, sort of disvalue those dreams, however small they might be, because it just represents like such a social elevator possibility for those kids?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. I mean, not to, inject my own preferences here, but I mean, I think that in general, providing more information, letting people make informed decisions is generally good policy. Um, so I think that, sort of like just um, general sort of like public awareness campaign to, to explain to families that your children are unlikely to succeed in this career path would be fine. It's low cost. An informational campaign would be low cost. I don't think it would significantly come to the detriment of Major League Baseball. They're players who are going to pursue these careers regardless of the odds. Um, but again, we do know that they overestimate their chances of success when they ask these young players, how many of your teammates are going to make it in professional baseball? They answer something like, I forget what it is, maybe 15 or 20%, which is outrageous, right? There's no way that this man, and this is not like once they've gotten to the Major League Baseball academies. This is in the informal academy. So there's no way that uh, uh, that many players can make it to professional baseball. So certainly, I think that that would be good. My hunch is that it probably wouldn't significantly affect these choices. And really, I think that the approach that Major League Baseball has taken is a good one. You know, even if the negative attention that they've received in the popular press isn't exactly accurate, they've responded with a lot of investment in local education and also as part of their PR campaign, they really emphasize, oh, look at these players in our academy who just graduated. They just finished their high school diploma. And that's something that they can, use to help make the organization look better. But there's also a benefit to the players themselves, and I think that that's great. It's pretty low cost for them. The players are still practicing baseball. They're just adding these classes on the weekends or at night as well. And I think that that's a good way to approach it. And it's hard to assess. Well, I think the wrong approach, not that you asked for this, but the wrong approach would be to try to kill the system entirely, which some have advocated for. Major League Baseball provides jobs. They you know they do invest in the local communities. The players who do succeed in the U.S. come back and invest millions of dollars in their home communities. It's hard to gauge the size of these investments, but for such a small country, it's easy to imagine that those are important. Um, and if it's not having this really detrimental effect that some allege, then there's no reason to eliminate those benefits.
Thank you.
Thanks, Georgi. More questions and comments? Kenneth.
Yeah, I wish I could comment more on kind of the estimations techniques and things, but some of this I'm seeing this for the first time and not familiar with the literature. But I wonder in what respect maybe you've been able to talk with people within the MLB directly. I don't know if you've asked anybody within the league this. I mean, I'm sure I could see implications also for the NBA, which has global academies, that they've decided to close recently, but they still have others in Africa and also South America.
Yeah, so my co-author has been somewhat successful in disseminating this paper among some not totally like low-level employees of Major League Baseball, but has gotten it circulated to an extent. Although we haven't received direct feedback on it, it's not entirely clear to me why that's the case, but that's something that I would be interested in getting or in opening a discussion. I mean, of course, we would like to hear more about the people who are on the ground and who know the topic better than we do, really to maybe point out any blind spots that we may have. In terms of implications, I mean, I agree. Like, so I'm less familiar with the NBA's recruiting abroad, but even like this year during the Super Bowl, the NFL was advertising, on one of their commercials about how they're opening recruiting efforts in Africa, right? They see this as a potential source of professional football talent, and so certainly there's implications there. A sport like soccer or football, as outside the United States, is an international sport and very popular in any number of developing countries in Latin America or in Africa, and so certainly there could be cases there where you might be concerned about students pursuing these careers instead of pursuing their education. It's just harder to look at the effects in those cases because it's such an international sport and talent comes from all over the world. It's not quite as concentrated as this industry. But certainly, yeah, I think that there are implications. I mean, not only in sports, but as we mentioned in the paper, in surveys of American teenagers, 1 in 4 American teenagers they plan to become a social media influencer. Now, social media influencing doesn't come with the same sort of, long period of training like baseball does, but you could imagine if teenagers are trying to put content online that attracts attention, they might put things online that they would later come to regret because they're overestimating their chances of becoming a social media influencer. Clearly, 1 in 4 people cannot be a social media influencer. So I think that more broadly, this paper can speak to those types of issues.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth. Yeah, I mean, my perspective, I'm always biased towards soccer, as you call it, and
Sorry.
no, you apologize. It's fascinating to hear the talk because I'd never really appreciated lots of the parallels. It's a very similar thing here historically, is that kids would pursue I want to be a footballer. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a footballer, and you kick the ball around all the time. But obviously, you're then forsaking an educational your educational attainment if you were to do that and pursue that. And it must be the case. I think you've kind of hinted at this. I just don't know it, but it must be the case that academies in baseball have a much stronger educational aspect now, because it's certainly true in football here that all academies will have a very recognized educational pathway as part of the sporting development as well.
Yeah, and I mean, even before the more formal educational aspect of the academies started, these teams, they invest in English language training, which I think is a pretty significant skill, especially in a country that has such strong economic ties to the United States, that has a significant tourism sector. Certainly that aspect, that's a major skill that could be learned. It's not always successful. There are famous Dominican players that do all of their interviews in Spanish, so it's certainly not a perfect system, but that's a benefit that comes with the academies as well.
Mm-hmm. Yogi, did you have another question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, sure. Unless someone else wants to go in front, I do have a
No
follow-up,
other hands?
please.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you. So something that is sort of near and dear to my heart, and in the context of sort of a similar promotion that young men they neglect school, is the hockey system in Russia. And the way it is parents often take out, personal loans. They do like lines of credits on their property to just, afford the equipment and to make sure that, their kids get ice time and professional coaching. So have you in your research noticed or considered sort of adding these variables? Because I mean, it's by and large your story is correct, right? So, I mean, not correct, but like it makes sense from the point that, at ages 12, 13, they start get scouting by Buscaderos. And then by age 16, the most talented kids get, added to the academy. And, baseball, especially, comparatively to hockey, is not that expensive of a sport to play. You don't need that much equipment. So have you noticed any of the stories of parents sort of taking financial risks to, assist their kids in their pursuit? And number two, if you have not, then have you considered adding such variable? Because there might be an issue of, can there be like a bribe system where you pay the Buscadero and say, well, go report to the academy that my kid is good and is the best on the team? Well, in reality, it might not be the case.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of the Russian hockey context, but maybe that's something I can just look into on the side because that sounds, yeah, comparable and really interesting. Um, yeah, so in most cases, as I mentioned before, it's actually the Buscones who are taking on the financial risk because they're taking on all these players and then they hope that one of them over the years will make it to the major leagues. And so even though these scouts have been sort of demonized in the popular press for exploiting child labor, the reason they're taking a cut of the uh, signing bonuses is because they're generally not charging the players to train them and often to house them and feed them and so on. But there are also a number of academies across the country, the ones that you can find online. It's not they're not associated with Major League Baseball, but they're not informal in the sense that it's just like, some guy picking up players in his community. There are a number of academies that parents can pay for to send their kids to train them. And so I would imagine that there is some element of this. I'm not aware of any data that we could acquire, but maybe that's something that we could look into. I mean, one thing that comes out of the USAID study is that this is not just like, the poorest children in society. These aren't the poorest families that are training for professional baseball. Often it's more like middle class players. And so in that case, you can imagine that there's financial risk being taken on by the parents themselves. So yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to dig into that more. I don't really have an answer now, but I would imagine that there's certainly some of that going on. And to the point that you brought up before, informing these families and these players that they're almost guaranteed to not make it to professional baseball could be helpful in ensuring that families don't overextend themselves, even if it's not, even if the effect isn't in education, which is what the popular press focuses on. If there's this other effect where families are taking on this financial risk, maybe that information could prove quite useful.
Great. Thanks, Georgi. A little bit of time if anyone else has any questions or comments they want to put to Brian. Looks like your presentation was sufficiently thorough that you covered all potential other questions people had, and we've had some discussion. As I said, thank you, Brian. It was a really interesting talk from my perspective, very educational. So thank you very much for that, and I wish you all the best as you develop your paper. Thanks everyone for attending. and we take a week's break next week. Next week we have no talk. I shall be on holiday, and I hope you all have a pleasant weekend and week. And we'll return on the 2nd of August with Andrew Smirnov presenting Striking Success, How Goals Shape Coach Bias in Football. So thanks again, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you all here again sometime soon.
Thank you all so much for the opportunity. This has been fun.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Brian.